Okay, so it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to talk more probably about tensions in literature, and literature is a different world, right? It's different from numbers, it's different from history, it's about perceptions. And I'm going to bring in a little bit of literature itself into the talk. Okay, let me see if I can. So there are as many Istanbuls as Istanbullus, inhabitants of Istanbul. This is basically the names of the city that you will find. Some of them refer to different parts of the city, but overall they refer to different expectations of the residents of the city from different neighborhoods. Today we all call it Istanbul, but it actually is a city with many, many names. From Istanbul itself, which means going downtown, to Dar Saadet, the Gate of Felicity, Konstantiniye, Payitaht, Asitane, Baba Ali, and so forth. And there's more. I just pulled these up. This is a city with many dreams, names, and feelings. American readers are familiar with huzun, a melancholy-like feeling, blues-like feeling that emanates from Orhan Pamuk's Istanbul, the 2006 Nobel laureate. In it, he writes about his emotional journey into the city and into the South. The book combines the author's memoir, coming-of-age story, with narratives about Istanbul by Turkish and European artists. All of Pamuk's work, in fact, from Cevdet Bey and Sons to Black Book, My Name is Red, and others, situates the city centrally in our cultural landscape, transforming the 20th century European, possibly, misperception that this magnificent city represented a form of Oriental otherness and stood in the periphery of Western cultural centers. Perhaps a little less accessible to the Western audience is another book by Pamuk, also on Istanbul. It's a novel, Black Book. Many readers cite the chapter in which we encounter this apocalyptic vision in Black Book, where the waters of the Bosphorus dries up. The bottom of the sea reveals remnants of the city's history, and of course imagine remnants of Istanbul's history at the bottom of the sea, without any chronological privileging of one period over the other. I would also turn to those chapters of the book where we explore Aladdin's store, a neighborhood store in Nişantaşı. Like the genie in the lamp, Aladdin sells all kinds of odds and ends to people, which fulfill diverse dreams of the neighborhood residents. Istanbul has a dream to offer to everyone, and Pamuk loves to usher us into a world where these dreams come alive. One could argue that reinstating Istanbul to its rightful place as a center of world literature and culture represents one of Pamuk's significant contributions. But clearly Pamuk is not alone, for Istanbul is the very stuff from which dreams are made. It's a city that has inspired much of artistic and literary output for centuries. From one worldly perspective, and I underline worldly, the gardens of merrymaking, the sweet breeze of roses, and the wine and the Ottoman court or divan poetry are that of Istanbul's. Not only the beloved hides in this space playfully, but the beloved itself is Istanbul. What I'm suggesting is that, like any majestic city, Istanbul has produced endless poetry and mythology. Perhaps unlike any other majestic city, Istanbul's mythology spans 2 continents and multiple traditions, which is impossible to cover within a brief talk such as this one. This is why I'm going to limit myself primarily to 20th century literature written in Turkish. And I would like to start with a glimpse into that with, okay, sorry about that. With this one. Yesterday, I gazed at you from a hilltop, blessed Istanbul. There is not a single part I have not been or loved. Come, sit on my heart's throne for as long as I live. Loving a single neighborhood, a single quarter of yours, is worth a person's life. This, of course, is a stanza from a much longer poem by Yahya Kemal Beyatlı, A Lover of Istanbul. It's also been made into songs. Like Beatles' stanza above and the song it inspired, one can gaze at each neighborhood of Istanbul and each dream for a lifetime, but we don't have a lifetime. So I am going to move full force, and I'm only trying to here, I think, suggest that even when I limit myself to literature written in Turkish from 1920s to present, I am facing still a daunting task because a lot of literature is about Istanbul, in fact. With that in mind, let me present you with a largely sporadic, it's a very sketchy view of Istanbul in contemporary Turkish literature. And at this point, you know, when you say Istanbul and literature, so much comes to mind, but I couldn't skip one other, so I'm going to do one more reading. I'm listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. At first there blows a gentle breeze and the leaves on the trees softly flutter or sway. Out there far away, the bells of water carriers incessantly ring. I'm listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. I'm listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. Then suddenly birds fly by, flocks of birds, high up, in a hue and cry, while nets are drawn in the fishing grounds and a woman's feet begin to dabble in water. I am listening to Istanbul, my eyes closed. I'm listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. The grand bazaar is serene and cool, a hubbub at the hub of the market. Mosque yards are brimful of pigeons. At the docks, while hammers bang and clang, spring winds bear the smell of sweat. I am listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. I'm listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed, still giddy since bygone bacchanals. A seaside mansion with dingy boathouses is fast asleep. Amid the din and drone of southern winds reposed, I am listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. I'm listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. Now a dainty girl walks by on a sidewalk. Cuss words, tunes, and songs, malapert remarks. Something falls on the ground out of her hand. It's a rose, I guess. I'm listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. I'm listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. The bird flutters round your skirt. I know your brow is moist with sweat, and your lips are wet. A silver moon rises beyond the pine trees. I can sense it all in your heart's throbbing. I am listening to Istanbul, intent, my eyes closed. Written during the 1940s, Orhan Veli's famous poem records not only the poet's feelings about the city and his beloved, but also preserves a poetic archive of sounds of the changing city. References to bells of water carriers, flutter of birds, dabble of feet in water are among the sounds disappearing, even if much else remains the same. In Veli's poem, Istanbul's seaside mansions and their dingy boathouses represent bygone eras. Not that Veli aims to preserve a particular tradition, quite to the contrary, he was a thoroughly modern poet whose work depicted ordinary people and everyday imagery. But the poem inevitably captures an everyday life that has been disappearing from sight with ever greater speed since the 1950s with the migration to Istanbul. Istanbul in the Republic period imagination is very much defined through the contrast between the past and present. The city's literary charm stems from its resilience. The city falls, but it survives its falls. And from its fomenting of past imperial lives, whether Byzantine or Ottoman, in everyday imagination. Much of the Republic period literature authored by Turkish intelligentsia depicts Istanbul with profound ambivalence. This is an ambivalence that simultaneously claims and denies those past lives. In 1923, the new regime was defined as a republic, and the political capital was moved from Istanbul to Ankara. This transition provided a modern-day incarnation of the literary trope of the fallen city. At the end of World War I, when the city surrendered to the British invasion, it falls from grace with the nationalists, who later declare Ankara as their capital. This act is registered as hailing of the countryside against the cosmopolitan city, the cosmopolis. Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, whose work represents the ambivalent cultural transformation from the lost empire to the new republic, celebrates each neighborhood of Istanbul in his novel A Mind at Peace. translated into English, so available. Praising the picaresque qualities of the various corners of the city, Tanpınar yearns to capture the music of each neighborhood during the interwar period through a love story. Similarly, in his book of essays on 5 cities, Tanpınar depicts Istanbul as the crown jewel of a city next to other important centers such as Konya, Erzurum, Bursa, and Ankara. Much like Veli's poem, which captures the city through its sounds, Tanpınar's essay breathes life into Istanbul of the 1950s and earlier eras through sounds of street vendors selling salep and boza. These are winter drinks, sweet winter drinks. According to Tanpınar, street sounds signal the changing of seasons. If salep and boza sellers announced the advent of winter, yogurt sellers served as the harbinger of spring. Not unlike another ambivalent author of modernity, William Butler Yeats, who dreamed of sailing to Constantinople to remedy modernity in which the center didn't hold, Tanpınar gazes at Istanbul with apprehension. His narratives about the city reflect a sense of being sieged by modernity, to which the city will eventually fall prey. This is why he sets out to preserve the everyday life of the changing city, even when he mocks modernity in the Clock-Setting Institute. And this is a little passage from the Clock-Setting Institute about different neighborhoods in the social life of the city. This was the cafe in Şehzadebaşı in which I used to spend my free time. The cafe took all its characteristics from its eventually bankrupt proprietor. This man knew almost half of the people in Istanbul. People of every type and character used to come to the cafe. Rich wastrels, bankrupt or down at the heels merchants, unknown poets, journalists, painters, high officials, chess and domino masters, ex-wrestlers, and 1 or 2 university professors, and a bunch of students, actors, musicians. Despite their being divided into little groups, nearly all of them virtually lived together. In Tanpınar's work, the markers of city's time are intimate and heavenly. Whistles of steamboats and daily prayers sung in tunes familiar to children of the empire. These sounds conjure up the eternal childhood and a refuge from the tumultuous yet inevitable modernity. Tanpınar's work represents a social transformation in the city, the shattering of one world and the emergence of another. In subject matter, Said Faik also turned to the city, depicting the lives of the urban poor, the fishermen, the petition writers, the orphans, with less elaboration but equal devotion. But for most of the Republic period authors, Istanbul has been the seat of cosmopolitan decadence, an imperial fall that has turned its back to the suffering of the common people. Kuntay's 3 Istanbuls, written during the 1930s, chronicled the turning points of the city during the late Ottoman period through the lifespan of its hero, Adnan. Yakup Kadri Karaosmanoğlu's 1928 novel, Sodom and Gomorrah, the title speaks for itself, covers Istanbul as a site of deceit and indifference. Sort of. The city nurtures hedonistic endeavors in Sodom and Gomorrah. The nation is betrayed by the self-promotion and lustfulness of the city's elite, who freely socialize with officers of the occupying British Army. The city is seat of 2 stock characters that are well known in Turkish fiction around this time, the ultra-westernized snob and his flirtatious female counterpart. British officers, jazz bands, local intelligentsia frequent bars and restaurants in Taksim and around Pera, including the Tokatlian Hotel. In a semi-utopic novel written in 1934, Karaosmanoğlu articulated the contrast between Istanbul and the Anatolian hinterland, which is represented by Ankara. Istanbul represented the country's past and Ankara its present. Karaosmanoğlu reimagined the new polis, the cultural and political nerve center, as Ankara. But Karaosmanoğlu shared Tanpınar's ambivalence about the changes introduced by modernity, including the new reforms and everything else. In another classic, he depicted the Anatolian countryside, the vicinity of Ankara and Eskişehir, as the untamed wilderness, hardly fit for an Istanbul gentleman. Published in 1932, the novel entitled The Wild wreaked havoc in Turkish intellectual circles that had committed to the Republican project, now centered in Ankara. Very much a cosmopolitan gentleman himself, Kara Osmanoğlu seemed bewildered at the prospect of inventing the nation out of the remnants of a vast and sophisticated empire, and in this wilderness. Kara Osmanoğlu's good friend and feminist nationalist Halide Edip also defined Istanbul as the modern republic's other. In 1922, in a novel called Shirt of Flame, the daughter of Smyrna, Ayşe, stood up to the British officers and well-bred Istanbul ladies, the self-absorbed, the wealthy, the cosmopolitan individuals who only lived for themselves, in defense of the country. In the novel, Edip's narrator described the war-torn Constantinople against the background of a defiant and victorious Ankara, where Mustafa Kemal's armies were stationed. In early Republic period fiction, Istanbul emerges as the point of departures from which young patriots, sons and daughters of the Republic, launch missions of enlightened developmentalism. Often incapacitated by war or heartbroken due to unrequited love or both, characters left Istanbul for the countryside, much like the heroine of another 1922 classic Çalıkuşu by Reşat Nuri Gültekin. In fact, much of the fiction produced during the 20s and 30s represented Istanbul as a point of departure. Young people left the polis both to carve out a new future for themselves and to help build the countryside. Kemal Tahir's 1956 novel Inhabitants of the Captured City bolstered the image of the city as the fallen capital of decadent empires. The great poet Nazım Hikmet, who revolutionized poetry with his radical subject matter and syllabic verse, commemorated the rise of the countryside and sought to be buried anonymously, actually, under a tree in Anatolia. Socialist authors like Sabahattin Ali underscored the hard-working simplicity of the Anatolian peasant. In fact, a new generation of authors like Yaşar Kemal literally came from the countryside and depicted the rural landscapes, folklore, and lexicon of Anatolia. Imperial city left behind. Attila İlhan in 1981 revisited the theme of the fallen city in his novel Morning Prayers in Der Saadet, the Sabah Ezanları, which portrayed Istanbul as a city under the Allied occupation. The reference to one of the many names of Istanbul, Der Saadet, the place of happiness, which means the gate of happiness, really, suggested that the city was the dwelling of the indulgent few. The novel depicted many locations, including the Petrograd patisserie in Tepebaşı, which was the meeting ground of local notables. Now, as an aside, literature is a wonderful place where you want to see these social locations of in different parts of the city. Literature featured Istanbul's cafes richly as points of social interaction and politicking. Petrograd, a patisserie which reflected the influence of the white Russians coming to Istanbul after the 1917 revolution in Russia, was featured not only in İlhan's novel, but in Sadah Birsel's narratives about Beyoğlu. So did Nisuaz, which was the meeting ground of artists like Orhan Veli, the poet of I'm Listening to Istanbul Intently, Said Faik, İlhan Berk. Painters like Abidin Dino, Leopold Levi, Nuri İyem, Avni Arbaş, Bedir Rahmi İyiboğlu preferred the Vienna Cafe. These are all names very well known in Turkish, to the Turkish audience and in Europe. Different corners of the city offered different social and political engagements. Cağaloğlu appeared in memoirs and narratives about publishing and journalism, and Tepebaşı about theater, vaudeville, and other entertainments. More recently, at the turn of the 20th century, Ahmet Altan's novels, in particular Pierced by the Sword and Love During the Times of Revolt, and Ayşe Kurt's 2003 novel, Farewell, a Mansion in the Occupied Istanbul, represented once again the city through its spectacular fall. According to Martin Stokes, and I quote here, no place had a more complex and crucial role in mediating the place of Turkey in the world than Istanbul. If modernist republican aspirations were clearly focused on Atatürk's capital, Ankara, Istanbul was condemned as an unpromising site for national regeneration. The labyrinthine complexity of the streets, the mixed population, the schizophrenic placeness between Europe and Asia, serving as a telling foil for the nation's builder's vision of a modern society. End of quote. But Istanbul was not just modern capital Ankara's other. It also represented the forbidden fruit, an object of desire that harms its possessor, like the poisonous apple of the Snow White. It brings me to the last and most enduring literary trope about Istanbul as the city yet to be conquered. While the Republic period novelists depicted the city as the site of imperial defeat and a point of departure to Anatolia, in reality, since the 50s, the city had been appropriated by ever-growing population of rural migrants demanding their share of felicity from the gate of felicity. The new narrative of Istanbul as the point of arrivals rather than departures was recounted the best by the novelist Orhan Kemal in his 1962 novel Birds of Exile, Gurbet Kuşları, also made into a movie in 1964. The city was described as the object of Anatolian desire. And this is where I think I'm going to try to get to my Mozilla, right? Okay, here is a very well-known scene from the film version of Birds of Exile. This is an Anatolian family arriving from the provincial city of Maraş into Istanbul. They get out of the train station and then they gaze at the iconic scenery of Istanbul, which is very well known to all newcomers to Istanbul. Today, there are many different entry points to the city, but in those days, this was the entry point.
Sallanmangalan, Selim, Burak, Hatice, Fatma, Kemal. Hey, takım tamam. Dikkat edin, birbirimizi yitirmeyelim. İstanbul'da şakaya gelmez bu iş.
Lazım mı Hacı Baba?
İlazım değil, de geç işini baba.
Gideriz ya.
Hadi bakalım, davranın. Hey, Allah'ın izniyle şah olacak İstanbul'da şah.
Bu kadar insan sırt sırta verdik mi kolay.
Dağları bedesten ederiz vallahi.
Ederiz.
Bırakın ben, ne oluyor yani?
Ne var? Niye sürüklüyorsunuz bu adamı?
Kayseri'den trene bindi. Bileti yoktu, indirdim. Sonra nasılsa gene binmiş.
Biladımı düşürdüm de inanmıyorlar.
Sonra ben yakaladım, ara istasyonlarda birinde indirdim.
3. defa binmiş.
Dalga geçmem, vapura giriyor.
There's another part of the movie way later, and you may be able to find it. I don't know if images speak for themselves, but much later into the first hour, there's a part where one of the sons here actually goes to on top of a hill overlooking the shantytown neighborhoods in Istanbul, built by newcomers, new rural immigrants. He and his fiancée look there at a new beginning for the city again. So, that part I'm not going to be able to show, but this is a very, very famous film and narrative. So the new narrative of Istanbul as the point of arrivals was recounted best by Orhan Kemal, as I said. To use a phrase familiar to American popular culture, the idea was that if you could make it in Istanbul, you could make it anywhere. So analogy, of course, being to that of New York, right? Cruel as it may be, the city beckoned fresh blood, and in the famous film adaptation, the family from Maraş arrived in the historical Haydarpaşa train station, basically saying that they have arrived at a place whose pebbles and stones are in gold, taşı toprağı altın, and that they hope to be Shah or Padişah, a sultan, to this new place. Which of course doesn't quite happen that way, right? There are no lotteries to be won, there are no lucky accidents, and Istanbul is a big city and they get lost in it fairly soon. Only really the son that studies medicine is, we are told, he's likely to make it in Istanbul, and he prefers to stay in his country even though he has other options. Whereas the rest of the family actually leave from the Sirkeci train station back to their town after an ordeal of a few years in Istanbul. So one could argue that with its booming migrant population, Istanbul has generations of new Istanbullers now. As much as being apart from the country now, it is really a part of the vast Anatolian countryside, or vast Anatolian homeland. In that sense, Latife Tekin's 83 novel, written in the style of magical realism, Berce Kristin, Tales from the Garbage Hills, casts any metropolis, whether Istanbul or Ankara, as the home of the haves and have-nots. The novel chronicles the building of shanty town by a rural migrant population on the piles of the garbage dumped by the wealthy urbanites. Both an emergence and a disintegration story, Berce Kristin elaborates on doing and undoing of communities by dreams and stories and by industrial plants and greedy landlords. I'm wrapping up. As a modern literary landscape, Istanbul, and it's a literary landscape that I'm speaking about, literature is about perceptions more than anything else. As a modern literary landscape, Istanbul engenders complex feelings that I've tried to outline here. So the first feeling that I brought up was the feeling of ambivalence about Istanbul and what it represents. The second was hüzün, which is related to that ambivalence, the melancholy-like feeling that Orhan Pamuk talks about. Resentment and lust were the two other very powerful feelings that I also brought up that Istanbul engenders. Going back to Tanpınar, whose hüzün infects Pamuk, one must contemplate different facets of a city because, according to Tanpınar, cities shape our dreams, just as our dreams shape the landscape of the cities. City spaces offer intersections. By spaces, I mean places like Haydarpaşa train station, or the Haydarpaşa station where they arrive and gaze at the scenery, where the rural migrants of Orhan Kemal come. And Sirkeci train station where they leave for Maraş, the dingy boathouses whose damp breeze brushes Orhan Veli's face, the narrow streets where vendors announce the changing of seasons, and cafes where artists and foreigners collide. What makes Istanbul what it is are these spaces, which offer intersections of the past and present. It remains to be seen whether they survive beyond literature and literary imagination as markers of historical depth, the city's lived experiences, or disappear as the city's past gets transformed by its present. Thank you.
Question, just to bring it back to architecture, which is we're hearing a lot about the imaginary, we're hearing history and images and ideas of heritage being remade in a kind of second wave from the first. We're talking about literary pieces, we're talking about the reality of demographics. And I'm wondering if as designers we are designing for an imaginary still, or are we designing for the reality? And do you have any final, maybe not final, but opening and final remarks for us to consider? Because I think all of these things are so much of what we are grappling with, trying to figure out what is universal, what does something look like. This idea of hybrid is almost too easy to say at this point. So if you have other opinions for us, just to bring this together, I think that would be great.
Can I put something up here for a second?
Shall I need time for that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, please stay.
Okay, so I really don't have any grand ideas, and particularly in relation to architecture, which is far removed in some ways from my field. But
except your words are very similar to the way we speak. So,
that's reassuring. But I probably would just bring up this idea that the city has different locations and different social spaces, and a city gets to become a city by means of those social spaces and what somebody does, what people do in those social spaces. I mean, if you take Haydarpaşa and turn it into a hotel, which is, I think, what it's slated to become, will it still be Haydarpaşa? No. Will we remember what it does? I don't know. And what will happen during that process of transforming it, like I think the roof has burnt down, and we don't know what will happen next. So my question, perhaps, to you guys, rather than a statement, is how would you design so that you could respect some of those social interactions and the meanings that those interactions produce for the city, Because I think a city becomes a city with that kind of significance from the lived experience. There's a dimension of history there that needs to, we need to walk into that. It's another dimension. It's what makes a city a city. Mm-hmm. So how would you preserve that? How would you design in a way that preserves those different experiences,
or
the lived experiences?
Or provides for new experiences.
Or
Right.
provides for new, absolutely. I'm not suggesting at the expense of new experiences,
Right.
obviously, but it does require a lot of negotiating the past and the present, I think.
Yeah.